Hey everybody, it's Bob Crossan, Senior Managing Editor for Water and Waste Digest. I have with me today Samantha Williams. She is External Affairs Manager for Missouri American Water. We're going to be talking a little bit about diversity and inclusion, especially as it relates to visual communications that you're sending out to your customers and really to everybody who's out there. Samantha, thank you so much for being on the call. We really appreciate you taking the time. Thoroughly enjoyed your webinar not too long ago, and I just knew that we had to get you on here to talk a little bit about these topics because it was really eye-opening and enlightening to me. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I'm glad to hear that you learned a lot on the webinar, and I'm excited to dive a little deeper into it today.
Yeah, and we do have an article coming up from you really soon here. It's going to be in one of our upcoming issues. We're aiming for August right now for that. So definitely everyone make sure to mark on your calendar to read that issue when that comes out. But yeah, so let's start by describing diversity and inclusion. Could you describe that in your own words? You did separate them in this webinar when you were talking about them, kind of explaining how they are similar but different from each other.
Exactly. So, like for me, the easiest way to remember what the difference between diversity and inclusion is, imagine a party. So, diversity is you invite everybody to the party. Inclusion is you invite everybody to dance. So, it's incorporating people. It's not just having people in a room. It's making sure voices are heard. Maybe they even plan the party. They're there for the after party. So just making sure everyone is treated equally, has equal opportunity to be engaged and involved in every process along the way.
Yeah, and in terms of the visual communications, when you were talking about this, you showed some examples of like this is what an image looks like when it's inclusive, where everyone's kind of engaged in the photo and engaged with each other. And then there's other ones where it's like there's a bunch of people in the background, but the foreground is just one person on a computer, right?
Exactly. And, it's one of those things, and as a communicator, I love training myself. I love like just watching shows and movies just so I can learn. So one of my favorite shows used to be Mad Men, and like you could see the evolution of advertising and communication over the time and throughout the show. Where in the beginning, women were very secondary. There would be mostly a man starring in that commercial or in that advertisement. And over the years, we've accepted and learned and understood that, okay, maybe we shouldn't have women only in the background, right? Maybe women should be treated as equal as men. And I think now in 2021 and just moving forward, we need to do the same of all cultures, ethnicities, backgrounds, ages, veteran status, and even ability, just making sure everyone sees themselves in every marketing material.
Yeah, that representation, right? Like everyone is, this is a big
Exactly.
key part of this communication of representation mattering and how people connect to seeing people that look like them. And so if you use more communication like that from a utility standpoint, you're more likely to engage them. Am I wrong in that assumption, or is that really kind of the goal here?
That's the goal. I think the goal is like three parts, right? So the first is showing that not only are you talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. I think the second thing is building trust, because we see in a lot of communities, if I make the joke that everyone knows that ad in February in Black History Month where you might not see a person of color in an advertisement, the other 11 months of the year, but February you're inundated with it, right? So people want to see 365 days of the year, are they represented? That builds that trust in that community. And the third thing that a lot of people overlook is it says, hey, you can see yourself here, not just using the water we provide, but you can see yourself as an employee at American Water. You can see yourself as the president of American Water. And I think we often overlook that piece is how can we ask young people, especially kids, how can we ask them to be engineers or scientists or leaders in the water industry if we're not showing depictions that they can be in the industry?
Yeah, I want to put a pin in a couple of those because we are going to talk about those a little
Yeah.
bit later. But I wanted to jump back just quick to talk kind of about communicating with the public and that kind of thing, giving some a little more actionables for some of the folks that are in our audience about some common questions to ask when evaluating images, evaluating your communications. What are some of the good things to keep in mind when you're looking at these things to make sure that you're kind of everyone has a bias, and you
Right.
write about this in the article that everyone has a bias, but like, how do you recognize that bias in yourself so that you can make sure that your bias isn't totally influencing every message you send out?
So one thing I did, in the webinar and I tried to do in the byline is in the publication is I think sometimes when people hear the word bias, sometimes they take that as a negative. They're like, oh, I'm not biased, I'm not discriminating. And bias doesn't necessarily mean like a sexist or racist or ableist discrimination. It just means there's a blinder. So what I like to say instead of bias, sometimes I like to say, I ask myself, is it familiar to me? If
Hmm.
it's too familiar to me, then I'm leaving some other voices and perspectives out of the picture. And I'll give you a good example. Like if you love sports and you communicate in sports analogies, you're building off of the assumption that everybody understands sports. So you might inadvertently use images that are sports related to sell or market something. And if you share that in a community that's not into sports, that's going to be tone deaf. And I just use
Yeah.
sports as is something a little easier for people to agree upon or to understand without it being a sensitive subject matter. And growing up, one thing that I used to joke about is, so if you want to think about stereotypes, if you will. So my mom was actually the sports fanatic, while my father was into arts and movies. So if you're sending marketing ads to my household, and you're assuming my mom is going to be into makeup and fashion, you're not going to buy her. But if you tell her about LeBron James, or Michael Jordan or something, she got you. So I think it's one of those things, is breaking down assumptions. So I always ask myself, is it familiar? And am I building this off an assumption? Have I
Hmm.
asked people in that community what they like, or have I done research? And I think, especially in the water industry, we're really good about this on the technical side of things. We know we can't dig into the ground and lay pipes without understanding what the soil composition is. We have to understand what's the science, that's going on in the community. It's the same in visual communication. You can't just throw an ad in the community. You have to take a sample. You have to see what works in different areas. Something might work in one city, but might not work in another. So in Missouri, for example, the same advertisement in St. Louis will not pan well in Kansas City. It's totally different climates, different interests, different levels of progressiveness. So you have to keep all that in mind.
Yeah, different cultures even too.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things too that you noted was having more than just you looking at these things too. How do
Exactly.
you ensure who should you try to have look at all these things for one, and how do you ensure that their perspective is accounted for when you're doing these communications?
I think that's a two-pronged approach. So like the first part is internal. So I always say do an internal audit. Make sure you're auditing the perspectives of your department. So if you're in a communication department, understand where everyone's coming from. Are there people in the communication department that maybe, like I'll give you an example, like an intern or somebody that maybe their voice gets drowned out, weigh them equally. You want to hear from the
Hmm.
comms director as much as you want as an intern, because a lot of times that intern might have a fresher perspective or know things that you might not know, and it definitely helps. The other thing is pull people in from the community. One thing that we do at American Water that I love since I started here is we tap experts, so we bring in experts from different fields. We have Magic Johnson come and speak to us. We have people who can say, here's what worked in my business, here's what's worked for me. And don't be afraid to go to the very customers that you're trying to reach. Go to the customers. They're going to tell you, they're going to show you. Start reading local newspapers, start seeing what pans well or plays well in certain communities. um, I always joke and say, sometimes in communication, you learn what to do by learning what not to do. And so sometimes watching a misstep by somebody else can say, oh, well, maybe that's something we want to avoid. So again, just doing that internal audit in the beginning, doing it internally, and then auditing outside of your company and saying, is there a blind spot we have? And once you recognize you have a blind spot, find an expert, be it somebody local, be it like, another professional consulting firm, or somebody with their ears on the ground that can fill in that knowledge gap.
Hmm. That was something that you really stressed too. You talked about your experience actually like being on the ground and talking to
Yeah.
people in those communities and like handing out flyers and getting a lot of like what seemed like bad negativity, like a lot like towards you, right? Could you talk about that experience and like what that kind of taught you? Because that seemed like a really cool learning moment where it's like, oh, people just don't really trust what we're trying to sell here, even though we're not trying to really sell anything necessarily.
The funny thing is, my background, I've had the privilege of working in all different sectors, be it government, nonprofits, now private, being in the water industry. And I would say the biggest thing is every sector forgets that we are no longer operating in a silo. We are no longer in the era where, as a water industry, we can only pay attention to what's happening within the water industry. If I go to a customer, they're not saying like, oh, this is just my water provider. Keep in mind that every single company, be it Nike, be it I don't know, Amazon, everyone is marketing and reaching out to the same customers. That water provider, that water customer probably still shops at Amazon, or probably still, they are used to different things. So their standard's going to be different. So what I like to do is I pay attention to what's happening across the utility industry. I look at what's happening in energy. I'm looking at what's happening in electric and gas, because sometimes you can enter a space, or you can try to do a marketing campaign and have a negative blowback that has nothing to do with you. And I had this when I worked at a nonprofit. We moved into Portland, Oregon, and we were confused because we were all excited. We were trying the best we could to be inclusive, to reach out to different backgrounds, and to get people of color into the tech space. And when we got there, our marketing didn't work. And the first thing I did was like, hey, so what kind of marketing materials did we share? And we shared young techies, but it wasn't a lot of people of color. And I'm like, well, that's your first mistake. It's like, we need people of color on the poster, right? And so then something I learned is, even though that was the first mistake, the mistake actually predated us. We needed to do a better assessment of Portland. What was the history of Portland? What did other nonprofits face? And when I went to Portland, I realized that a lot of the local leaders had the original marketing material. So they were like, hey, now you're coming out 4 months later with marketing materials that have people of color on it. But for the last 3-4 months, you had nobody that looked like me. The other thing is, they were already tired of nonprofits promising things, because it was a break of distrust. It was a break of trust in the community. So I say all that to say, as a water provider, we may not be thinking of that, but we do. We need to think about that. We need to remember that even though we're trying to market to our customers, and we don't like saying marketing, we're really just educating our customers. Our customers are faced with a lot of messages every day. And so how do we differentiate ourselves from somebody else? The best way of doing that is listening, paying attention to what is also being shared around that time of the year. Like, again, pandemic aside, it's like right now everyone's at home, so they see everything, they hear everything, they're able to compare two companies side by side, with the click of a button. And so we're no longer in the day and age where we can't take other people into consideration. I don't really see us going back to the era of us being in a silo. We always have to be aware of what's going on.
Yeah, no, totally. We're in an era now where there's so many messages that people are seeing, and like you said, I think the one point that I really took away from this particular answer that you just gave was the whole thing about, like people see Nike and Amazon and all these big companies, they're setting the standard for
Hmm.
you whether you like it or not. So you
Yeah.
kind of have to meet, you kind of have to like look at what they're doing and be like, how do we elevate ourselves to get as close to that standard as we can? Because that's what people are going to expect, whether like I said, whether we like it or not, that's what people are going to expect.
Exactly. And it's one thing as communicators, like, so there's a conference I used to like going to called AIGA, and it's for communicators that focus on design and all that. And they used to say it all the time. It's like, hey, whether you like it or not, Nike, Apple, all these major companies are affecting our industry. And I make the joke, I'm St. Louis born and raised, so forgive all the St. Louis references, but it's like the steamboats. It's like, okay, just because we're known for steamboats, if we invent the train, that doesn't mean you have to stop caring about the train. It's like, you have to get on board is the whole message. And so I would say this is something I've kind of noticed in the scientific space, or industries that are very scientific and technical. sometimes that flashy Nike, Amazon ad stuff, it sounds like secondary. And it's like, well, no, that affects us too, because once again, if I'm a customer and I'm getting advertisements from other people and I see myself in their commercials, and here I am, a big industry company, and I put an ad out or a commercial out and it doesn't reflect the customer, they're going to raise questions. They're going to say, okay, so if Amazon can do that, why can't you do that? And I know that's not always fair. We don't all have Amazon's budget now. We're not Jeff Bezos, but the point is, it's free 99 to mix up your photos.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Samantha, thank you so much for talking about this. And like I said, I got a lot out of your webinar, and I hope that people get a lot out of this as well. We'll be sure to link to that webinar in the description below as well, so definitely check that out. And like I said, Samantha penned an article it's going to be publishing in our August issue of Water and Waste Digest, so please stay tuned for that. There's a lot of good information in there and actionables to take away from that too. For everyone who's watching, check out our playlist below as well. And Samantha, thank you so much for being on the call. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.